The siren wailed and Elena Carter said, "Mom, pick up," as smoke clawed the warehouse roof like a black tide that would not stop. Forklifts screamed, metal buckled, and Victor Hale said, "Keep the line running," from a glass office above the heat. Elena, 22, counted exits like prayers and said, "Lila, stay with me," while her chest hammered. Lila Nguyen said, "We can make it," but fear shook her voice like loose nails in a jar. Sparks rained across pallets, and Jonah Price said, "Back doors jammed," as if the truth were a blade. Marcus Reed burst through the loading bay and said, "Follow the light," swinging a flashlight like a beacon. Elena grabbed the fire hose and said, "Help me aim," her knuckles raw and bright against the rubber. The nozzle coughed steam, and the smoke curled low, hiding splinters that bit through her shoes. Ruth Alvarez had warned her last week and said, "Power without conscience burns twice," but Elena laughed then, and did not now. A girder fell with a scream of rust, and Elena said, "We move now," pulling Lila toward a stuttering exit sign that blinked like doubt. Victor turned away from the window and said, "Security will handle it," and the glass reflected his calm like ice. Elena felt the floor tremble and said, "If we wait, we die," and she ran because there was nothing else left to do. Dawn bled over the neighborhood, and Elena Carter said, "We lost hours, rent is due," as she wrung her jacket on the stoop where water pooled in the cracks. The rain had stopped, but the cold clung like an unpaid bill she could not ignore. Lila Nguyen said, "You saved me," while steam rose from paper cups they could barely afford. Sirens faded to memory, and Jonah Price said, "I did what I could," but the sentence landed light and crooked. Elena looked at the cracked window and said, "Victor will call it an accident, because men like that name storms after other people." Marcus Reed set 2 spare blankets down and said, "File a report," with a steady voice that warmed the air. A bus roared past, spraying them, and Elena said, "Reports don't fix rent," counting the coins in silence. Ruth Alvarez called from her porch and said, "Child, know your worth," handing a tin of salve with hands lined like maps. Lila smiled thinly and said, "We can find shifts," though her cough argued with hope. Elena watched the sky pale and said, "I will not drown on land," feeling a strange steel settle in her ribs. She knew Victor's calm was a storm wall, and she said, "He will not bury me in soot and silence," as the day opened and the city stared back. The factory floor reopened by noon, and Victor Hale said, "We appreciate resilience," as if the word were a leash tied to every paycheck. Elena Carter signed the clipboard and said, "This ink won't hide the burn marks," tracing a blister beneath her glove. Lila Nguyen said, "We need the hours," and her voice trembled like thin glass. Jonah Price said, "I heard they cut overtime," while his eyes slid toward the supervisor's door. Marcus Reed met Elena by the fence and said, "Union has a meeting," offering a flyer that flapped like a trapped bird. Elena folded it and said, "I can't miss shifts," counting every minute in rent. Ruth Alvarez said, "Strength is not a secret you keep under your tongue," as she pressed a bomb into Elena's palm. Machines coughed awake, and Elena said, "If they call this normal, we are already ghosts," staring at the wet soot, staining the roof. Victor passed on the catwalk and said, "Safety training soon," with a smile that carried no air. Elena breathed slow and said, "He wants me quiet," feeling the day narrow to a blade she could learn to hold. Lunch broke under a gray sky, and Elena Carter said, "Tell me the truth," as she cornered Jonah by the vending machines that hummed like distant insects. Jonah Price said, "Victor promised a promotion if I kept quiet," and the confession cracked like ice in a glass. Elena felt the ground tilt and said, "You sold the alarm logs," tasting metal as if the fire had crawled back. Lila Nguyen walked in slow and said, "Why would you hurt us?" and her voice folded on the last word. Jonah stared at his boots and said, "I was tired of counting pennies," as if hunger could excuse smoke. Elena said, "We were counting the same pennies," and the anger climbed her throat with claws. Marcus Reed opened the door and said, "Meeting tonight, no names on paper, offering a second path like a bridge in fog." Ruth Alvarez said, Betrayal is a mirror, not a map, from the hall where light pooled. Elena breathed hard and said, I choose the bridge, and the words steadied her knees. She watched Jonah flinch and said, You can choose it too, but the silence that followed felt final. Evening gathered in the church basement, and Elena Carter said, If we stand alone, he wins, as chairs scraped like restless birds. Marcus Reed said, We document injuries, we demand inspections, and the words built a spine in the room. Lila Nguyen said, I am scared, and fear felt honest, bright as a match. Ruth Alvarez said, Courage is fear with a job to do, folding sign-in sheets that smelled of ink. Jonah Price hovered near the door and said, I don't belong here, while shame clung like damp wool. Elena looked him in the eye and said, Belonging is a choice, though hurt still burned. Victor Hale drove past outside and said, Carry on to no one, as his headlights slid over the basement windows like searchlights. Elena felt the old ache of hunger and said, I refuse to be small, as voices rose and pens scratched. Marcus said, Tomorrow we file, and a murmur of agreement moved like a tide. Elena closed her eyes and said, I will not drown. And for a breath the future felt possible, hard-edged and real. The morning fog draped the mill yard, and Elena Carter said, We show up even when they want us silent, as her boots crunched frost like fragile glass. Marcus Reed handed her flyers and said, Visibility is power, his voice steady as steel. Lila Nguyen clutched her scarf and said, What if they fire us, with trembling that carried every sleepless night? Jonah Price shifted behind them and said, He'll see me first, because guilt stained his shadow darker than smoke. Ruth Alvarez emerged with a thermos and said, You stand taller with heat inside you, pouring coffee that smelled of quiet defiance. The gate screeched open, and Victor Hale said, Clock in or clear out, his tone carved cold enough to chill breath. Elena folded her flyer once and said, I'm not clearing out, though her pulse rattled. Marcus said, Courage makes enemies before it makes allies, standing shoulder to shoulder. Workers streamed past like river currents, some whispering, some ignoring. Elena lifted her chin and said, He owns walls, not our voices, though fear coiled inside her ribs. For a moment, the fog felt less like weight and more like a veil that could lift. By midday the Union Hall hummed with voices, and Elena Carter said, This room feels like breath after drowning, as she scanned the posters curling on the wall. Marcus Reed said, We write grievances, we demand answers, steadying a notebook against the scarred table. Lila Nguyen whispered, I never thought we'd sit here, her hands folded tight, knuckles pale. Jonah Price avoided her eyes and said, He'll know I spoke, though no one had yet accused him. Ruth Alvarez poured tea and said, Secrets are heavy until you speak them, her voice grounding the room like stone. A draft rattled the windows, and Elena said, He burned us, and called it normal, holding her words like fire. Marcus nodded and said, Every word on paper is a match, his pen carving the page. Posters for strikes of decades past flapped faintly, carrying ghosts of courage. Lila exhaled slow and said, Maybe we can matter, and the silence afterward carried fragile hope. Elena said, We already matter, pressing ink into lines that might outlast fear. That night, the alley stank of diesel. And Elena Carter said, You followed me, when Victor Hale's polished shoes broke puddles with disdain. Victor said, I own your hours, his words striking like cuffs. Elena's throat ached, but she said, You own walls, not me, though her breath smoked sharp in the air. Victor stepped closer and said, Defiance is expensive, with the ease of someone who never counted rent. Jonah Price emerged from shadow and said, I didn't call him, but guilt echoed louder than truth. Elena clenched her jaw and said, Betrayal has many faces, eyes cutting between them both. Lila Nguyen called from the alley mouth, Elena, don't, fear twisting her tone to glass. Victor smiled thin and said, You'll crawl back when hunger bends you before turning, coat flaring. Ruth Alvarez appeared behind Lila and said, He thrives on fear, offering her hand like an anchor. Elena's hands shook, but she said, Fear doesn't own me, letting her words fall heavy enough to break the night. The diner's neon buzzed against rain-streaked glass, and Elena Carter said, "He won't stop until someone makes him," stirring coffee she couldn't afford. Lila Nguyen said, "I can't lose another job," her hands trembling on a chipped cup. Marcus Reed leaned close and said, "You won't stand alone," the promise steady as oak. Jonah Price stared at the menu and said, "If he fires us all, what then?" His voice brittle as ash. Ruth Alvarez dabbed sugar and said, "Fire clears ground for growth," her eyes hard as truth. Elena breathed deep and said, "Then let it burn," though her stomach coiled. Rain hammered harder, neon reds bleeding into the room like warnings. Marcus said, "Tomorrow we walk together," and silence folded over them like armor. Elena gripped her cup and said, "I've drowned before, but not this time," feeling her resolve steel sharp. Morning broke with sirens, and Elena Carter said, "They locked the gates," as steel chains rattled louder than bells. Marcus Reed shouted, "Hold the line," while workers clustered, their voices rising like waves. Victor Hale stood above on the balcony and said, "Disperse or be removed," cold voice amplified by authority. Lila Nguyen gripped Elena's sleeve and said, "I'm scared," her words trembling. Elena pressed her hand over Lila's and said, "Fear means we're alive," raising her chin against the wind. Jonah Price muttered, "This will ruin us," as if ruin had not already come. Ruth Alvarez raised a placard and said, "We are more than their silence," steady voice cutting through the chaos. Guards pushed forward, and Elena shouted, "We are not shadows," every word sharp. The crowd echoed her, chants swelling until glass trembled. Victor's jaw tightened as Elena said, "You cannot drown us," and for the first time, power shifted in the air. The courthouse steps filled with chants, and Elena Carter said, "They hear us now," her voice echoing off stone like a hammer against iron. Marcus Reed raised a folder high and said, "Evidence doesn't burn," his arm trembling with conviction. Lila Nguyen clutched her scarf and said, "I never thought we'd stand here," though her smile flickered through fear. Jonah Price hung back and said, "He'll twist this," his eyes darting to the cameras. Ruth Alvarez steadied him and said, "Truth walks slower than lies, but it endures," her tone grounding. Victor Hale descended the marble steps and said, "This spectacle changes nothing," sneering with practiced indifference. Elena stepped forward and said, "Everything changes when we speak," her pulse steady as the chants rose. Reporters pressed closer, their flashes stinging. Marcus said, "History is built by moments like this," and the words rolled like thunder. Elena lifted her chin and said, "I will not be erased," and the crowd roared in unison, their voices louder than the gavel inside. Inside the courtroom the air felt brittle, and Elena Carter said, "We came with scars," as she scanned the polished benches. Marcus Reed whispered, "Stay firm," his knuckles white on a pen. Lila Nguyen said, "They will listen," though her voice quivered thin. Jonah Price said, "I betrayed, but I will testify," and the admission fell heavy as chains. Ruth Alvarez nodded and said, "Redemption begins when you speak truth aloud," her eyes steady. Victor Hale leaned toward his lawyer and said, "This is theater," his smirk unshaken. Elena said, "Theater reveals masks," her breath fogging in cold air. The judge entered, robes sweeping, gavel cracking like thunder. Marcus said, "This is our line in the sand," and the silence after vibrated. Elena's chest tightened, yet she said, "I will not bow," her words steady enough to carve through marble walls. Testimony crackled like sparks, and Elena Carter said, "We work through smoke and silence," her words carrying years of pain. Marcus Reed added, "Injuries buried under false reports," his tone sharp. Lila Nguyen said, "I feared dying for a paycheck," and the gallery gasped. Jonah Price rose, voice breaking as he said, "I erased alarms for promises," guilt spilling across every syllable. Ruth Alvarez whispered, "Let truth breathe," as if urging him forward. Victor Hale stood and said, "Lies from bitter workers mean nothing," arrogance dripping. Elena said, "Truth burns liars brighter than fire." Her eyes locked on him. The judge's gavel cracked again, silencing the storm. Marcus said, "We came to speak what was hidden," his words shaping the air. Elena said, "You cannot drown us now," her chest rising with resolve, and the silence after felt heavier than chains. The verdict loomed, and Elena Carter said, "Whatever they decide, I know who I am," her voice low but steady. Marcus Reed said, "You've already won by standing," his hand resting near hers. Lila Nguyen whispered, "I feel lighter," though her eyes still shimmered. Jonah Price said, "Maybe forgiveness is possible," as if speaking to himself. Ruth Alvarez said, "Victory is not always the paper, but the change in spirit," her gaze kind. Victor Hale smirked and said, "Paper decides power," tapping his lawyer's arm. Elena leaned forward and said, "Power built on silence rots," her words sharp as blades. The jury returned, their faces unreadable, the shuffle of feet louder than thunder. Marcus said, "This is history's moment," and silence thickened. Ella closed her eyes and said, "I will not break," holding to steel inside her ribs as the foreman stood. The gavel struck, and Elena Carter said, "We are seen," as tears rimmed her eyes. Marcus Reed said, "The fight has only begun," his jaw hard but hopeful. Lila Nguyen sobbed and said, "We mattered," clutching Elena's sleeve. Jonah Price exhaled and said, "I am not beyond redemption," his shoulders finally loosening. Ruth Alvarez said, "Children of fire walk forward with scars but with light," her words warm. Victor Hale stood, face drained, and said, "This isn't over," yet the tremor betrayed him. Elena rose and said, "It is over for your silence," her voice carrying past the courtroom walls. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching. Marcus said, "The tide turned today," and the phrase hung steady. Elena looked toward the sky through tall windows and said, "I will not drown," as if declaring it to the world, and the gavel's echo sealed the moment like iron. The strike banners rippled against the dawn wind, and Elena Carter said, "We carry scars into the street," her breath steaming in the chill air. Marcus Reed shouted, "They cannot bury us in silence," holding a megaphone that cracked with defiance. Lila Nguyen clutched a placard and said, "I still feel the fire in my chest," her voice trembling but unbroken. Jonah Price lingered near the back and said, "I will not run this time," determination trembling beneath his guilt. Ruth Alvarez lifted her hands and said, "Children, the storm has begun," her words steady as the morning bell. Victor Hale stood on the factory balcony and said, "This ends today," his words amplified with disdain. Elena stared up at him and said, "It ends when we say it ends," her jaw tight with resolve. Marcus said, "Stand shoulder to shoulder," as boots scraped against pavement like drums. The air thickened with chants, and Elena said, "We are not shadows anymore," raising her fist as the sun broke through the smoke-gray sky. The police line thickened, shields gleaming, and Elena Carter said, "They send walls to crush voices," her hands trembling only once. Marcus Reed said, "Hold your ground," his words cutting through the chant's rhythm. Lila Nguyen whispered, "They look like machines," fear choking her breath. Jonah Price said, "I'll stand here," planting his feet with more strength than apology. Ruth Alvarez said, "Stand as water, not stone," her calm tone weaving like balm. A helmeted officer barked, "Disperse now," his voice flat as iron. Elena said, "We will not," her chin high. Marcus lifted both arms and said, "Peaceful, all of you," his command heavy with urgency. Shields rattled forward, and Elena shouted, "We are not afraid," the chant swelling behind her like a rising tide. The morning cracked with tension, and silence before the clash felt louder than thunder. The first push sent bodies stumbling, and Elena Carter said, "Stay together," gripping Lila's hand as the line buckled. Marcus Reed said, "Document everything," lifting a phone to capture the surge. Lila Nguyen cried, "They're hitting us," her voice sharp as glass shattering. Jonah Price stepped in front and said, "Not this time," blocking a baton swing with his shoulder. Ruth Alvarez said, "Stand firm, children," her calm voice cutting through chaos. Victor Hale watched from the balcony and said, "Break them," his lips curling with disdain. Elena roared, "We are not breakable," her words raw and fierce. Marcus shouted, "This is evidence of their fear," steady, even as sweat streaked his brow. Lila clung tighter and said, "I won't let go," trembling with defiance. Elena's chest burned, but she said, "We rise higher than chains," her eyes blazing through the chaos of steel and smoke. Tear gas hissed white, and Elena Carter said, "Don't let the smoke blind us," her voice muffled in haze. Marcus Reed said, "Cover your faces," tying fabric over his nose. Lila Nguyen coughed and said, "I can't breathe," her eyes watering raw. Jonah Price grabbed her arm and said, "Stay with me," guiding her through the blur. Ruth Alvarez said, eyes closed, heart open, steady as if time slowed. Officers pressed forward, and Victor Hale said, "Clear them out," his hand slicing downward. Elena shouted, "We are fire and fog," defiance breaking through the choke. Marcus said, "Keep filming," his phone trembling in his grip. Lila gasped and said, "We won't vanish, though each breath scrape." Elena raised her voice once more and said, "This smoke will not silence us," her figure glowing in the white cloud as Chance refused to die. The sirens faded, leaving silence broken only by coughs, and Elena Carter said, "We still stand," her words hoarse but unbroken. Marcus Reed said, "They cannot erase this," lifting his phone like proof. Lila Nguyen whispered, "We're bruised but not gone," clutching her side. Jonah Price wiped his eyes and said, "I chose right this time," breath ragged. Ruth Alvarez said, "Victory is not absence of pain, but persistence through it," her voice steady. Victor Hale stood above, pale and shaken, and said, "This is not the end," though his tone cracked. Elena looked at him and said, "It ends when your silence does," her chest rising with fire. Marcus said, "The world has seen," as chants reignited in the battered crowd. Lila managed to smile and said, "We are still here," her voice fragile but proud. Elena raised her fist and said, "We will not drown," and the survivors roared until even the sirens bent to their sound. Night wrapped the church basement in hush, and Elena Carter said, "Tomorrow we reclaim the floor," while papers spread like maps. Marcus Reed said, "We present the safety plan and demand signatures," tapping a checklist that gleamed with ink. Lila Nguyen said, "I still dream of the smoke," and her fingers trembled on a pen. Jonah Price said, "I found the emails," and fear shivered under his certainty. Ruth Alvarez said, "Truth must walk in daylight," pouring tea that steadied their breath. Elena said, "If he throws us out, we film it," picturing the entrance like a stage. Marcus said, "We bring reporters and an inspector," his voice hammer hard. Lila said, "What if Victor locks the gates again?" and the question hung like fog. Jonah said, "He can lock steel, not eyes," holding a flash drive tight. Ruth said, "Children, courage eats lies for breakfast," and the small laugh lifted the room. Elena drew a line under her notes and said, "No more drowning," and the promise sat in her chest like light. Morning broke cold and bright, and Elena Carter said, "Record from the first step," as cameras blinked awake. Marcus Reed said, "Inspector meets us at 9, checking his watch with soldier calm." Lila Nguyen said, "I brought copies," and the paper stack felt heavier than fear. Jonah Price said, "Board members will be inside," and guilt tugged at his voice. Ruth Alvarez said, "Stand where the whole street can see," guiding them like stars. Victor Hale strode to the balcony and said, "You trespass on private property," turning law into a blade. Elena said, "We stand on public truth," and her breath smoked like steam. Marcus said, "Open the gates or face an injunction," steady as iron. Lila said, "No more locked alarms," her voice thin but fierce. Jonah lifted his phone and said, "Smile for the board," as the inspector's car rolled in. Elena felt the crowd rise and said, "We are done asking," and doors that had swallowed hope finally looked fragile. Inside the floor the lights hummed, and Elena Carter said, "We start with ventilation," as the inspector traced soot scars. Marcus Reed said, These logs showed disabled alarms, laying pages that smelled of ink and ash. Lila Nguyen said, "We were working through poison," and her words rang like struck glass. Jonah Price said, "Emails order silence," and the flash drive blinked red like a pulse. Ruth Alvarez said, "Do not flinch at truth," steadying Lila's shoulders. Victor Hale said, "Operational necessity," with a chill that numbed corners. Elena said, "Necessity never justifies neglect," her voice steady enough to cut. Marcus said, "Witness statements corroborate," pointing to signatures lined like footsteps. Lila said, "We will not die for quotas," and her throat steadied. Jonah said, "I sign my statement," surrendering the last of his shadows. The inspector closed his notebook and said, "This site shuts down today," and the machines seemed to exhale. The boardroom smelled of leather, and Elena Carter said, "You signed lives away," as city light fractured across glass. Marcus Reed said, "We propose worker oversight and retrofits," laying a timeline like rails. Lila Nguyen said, "Pay for medical screenings," and the words landed heavy. Jonah Price said, "I aided his scheme," and the confession chilled the room. Ruth Alvarez said, "Redemption requires restitution," voice like a bell. Victor Hale said, "You have no leverage," but sweat began to thread his collar. Elena said, "You lost the floor and the inspector," and silence spread. Marcus said, "Approve our plan, or lose the contract," showing headlines that pulsed on tablets. Lila said, "We are not expendable," and her eyes did not blink. Jonah said, "I will testify to each directive," and the last wall cracked. The chairwoman cleared her throat and said, "Mr. Hale is relieved," and the city outside felt newly possible. Sunset washed the rebuilt floor in amber. And Elena Carter said, "We begin again," while fresh filters hummed like quiet vows. Marcus Reed said, "Oversight Committee meets weekly," pen clicking with measured pride. Lila Nguyen said, "I can breathe without fear," and her smile held. Jonah Price said, "I'll make repairs for as long as it takes," and relief softened his shoulders. Ruth Alvarez said, "Growth blooms from scorched ground," tying a ribbon on a notice board. Victor Hale's office sat empty, and Elena said, "Power is not a room, it is a promise," staring through the glass. Marcus said, "We turned drowning into tide," and the line felt true. Lila said, "We are the floor and the future," hands resting on safe rails. Jonah said, "Thank you for not leaving me behind," and the words lifted. Elena touched the switch and said, "Lights on," as a clean breath moved through the ducts. The machines answered with life, and the city outside kept time with their steadier hearts. The community hall throbbed with applause, and Elena Carter said, "We fixed air, but not the future," as microphones blinked red. Marcus Reed said, "We codified oversight, tapping a binder like a shield against doubt." Lila Nguyen said, "I sleep without sirens now," and the room softened for a beat. Jonah Price said, "I owe you all my spine," and his voice steadied. Ruth Alvarez stood near the back and said, "Victories are bridges, not islands," her eyes measuring the crowd. A reporter's phone flashed an alert, and Elena said, "What happened?" gripping the podium. Marcus scanned the screen and said, "The board is courting a buyer," each syllable falling like bolts. Lila whispered, "Offshore," and the word tasted like ash. Jonah said, "They will erase us with signatures," shoulders tightening. Ruth stepped forward and said, "I kept something you need to see," her tone built of years and fire. Elena breathed deep and said, "Then tonight we trade celebration for truth," and the clapping turned to flint. In Ruth's kitchen the kettle hissed, and Elena Carter said, "What did you keep?" as steam fogged the window. Ruth Alvarez said, "A ledger from 19 years ago," sliding a cracked folder across tile like a confession. Marcus Reed said, "Whose name's his thumb hovering over the first page?" Ruth said, "Your mother died in a warehouse fire run by Victor's father," and the room shrank to a pulse. Lila Nguyen said, "They repeated the script, tears rising hard." Jonah Price said, "They hid the settlement and bought silence," voice low with anger. Ruth said, "I was the clerk who filed the checks," Then I refused my own, dealt steady and plain. Elena pressed her palm to the paper and said, "He built my hunger from her ashes, breath-catching." Marcus said, "This ties legacy to negligence, already outlining a plan." Ruth said, "I waited for a spine like yours," and her eyes shone. Elena closed the folder and said, "We end the bloodline of silence," steel returning to her throat. At dawn the city plaza filled with breath, and Elena Carter said, "We fight the sail with sunlight, as banners unfurled like wings." Marcus Reed said, "Injunction, press conference, council motion, counting steps like drumbeats." Lila Nguyen said, "We bring the ledger to the world, voice steadier than sleep." Jonah Price said, "I'll face the cameras and name my part, shoulders squared." Ruth Alvarez said, "I will swear under oath," and the promise cut through cold air. The board's statement hit phones, and Elena said, "They frame it as efficiency, lips hard." Marcus said, "Then we frame it as lives, eyes narrowing." Lila said, "If they leave, our rents break us," staring past the crowd to small windows. Jonah said, "No more erasing," as reporters threaded microphones forward. Elena faced the steps and said, "This city is not a body you can harvest," and the chant rose like a tide around steel. The archive room smelled of dust and toner, and Elena Carter said, "Chain of custody matters," as clerks slid boxes to their table. Marcus Reed said, "We request certified copies," tapping a statute number for the camera. Lila Nguyen said, "Here are the matching payout codes," her finger landing on columns that trembled history awake. Jonah Price said, "This email thread shows directives to suppress alarms, breath tight but steady." Ruth Alvarez said, "I'll notarize my statement now," already signing with precise strokes. A board attorney arrived late and said, "You're grandstanding," trying a smile that did not reach. Elena said, "We're documenting," and her voice made the room feel larger. Marcus said, "These files join the injunction, sealing envelopes like anchors." Lila said, "Numbers don't lie when names ride them," closing a binder. Jonah said, "Send to every newsroom," and the clerk nodded. Ruth gathered the papers and said, "Truth has paperwork," and even the copiers seemed proud. Afternoon thunder stacked over City Hall, and Elena Carter said, "We ask for an emergency vote," as rain needled the plaza. Marcus Reed said, "Injunction filed, evidence served," voice ringing like a bell. Lila Nguyen said, "We are not numbers," and the gallery murmured in assent. Jonah Price said, "I was the weak link, now I am the witness," and shame finally loosened its grip. Ruth Alvarez said, "This ledger ties a daughter's grief to a company's pattern," lifting the file with quiet fire. The council chair said, "We will not bless a sale built on harm," and the room stirred. A board envoy stiffened and said, "You risk jobs," but the wind hammered the windows like truth. Elena said, "Jobs without dignity are cages," and her words carried. Marcus said, "Adopt the moratorium," pointing to drafted language. The vote rolled eye by eye, and Lila sobbed once. Elena looked up through rain-blurred skylight and said, "Mom, we are not drowning anymore," and thunder answered with light. Elena Carter said, "We won time, not peace," as Marcus Reed held the checklist. Lila Nguyen whispered, "Rent still hunts me," but Jonah Price vowed, "I'll guard alarms," and Ruth Alvarez said, "Hold vigilance." Victor Hale sneered, "The city forgets in the corridor." Elena Carter replied, "Fear is bankrupt." Marcus Reed lifted the ledger, Lila Nguyen said, "We remember smoke," and Ruth Alvarez closed the moment with silence. At the memorial fence, Elena Carter said, "Mom, I carry the ledger." Marcus Reed lit a candle. Lila Nguyen said, "Her name teaches breath." Jonah Price laid a wrench, and Ruth Alvarez said, "Grief is a river." The warehouse turned festival, as Elena Carter said, "Sign for training." Marcus Reed added, "First aid, ventilation," while Lila Nguyen guided parents. Jonah Price laughed with apprentices, and Ruth Alvarez served soup. On the roof at dawn, Elena Carter said, "I choose air over ashes." Marcus Reed shared a thermos. Lila Nguyen laughed from stairs. Jonah Price waved below, and Ruth Alvarez tied her scarf with care.